Hello and welcome to part 8 in this Twitter integration video series. In this video I'd like to cover how to create a context menu so that when you right click on the header of an archive control, you get this menu displayed for sorting, configuring your sort order, configuring your columns, etc. So that when I click on, say, configure columns, for example, it opens up the archive configuration dialog and shows me the columns that I'm allowed to see inside my archive control, as well as the sort order that will be in effect when those items are displayed. So if we click over to our Twitter application and I right click on the header control right now, I'm doing this, you can't see it of course, but the menu is not appearing, and that's because I haven't a menu item declared for that header control yet. So what I want to do is switch over to Visual Studio and begin to demonstrate how to construct that context menu for the header control. Okay, so here I am inside Visual Studio. I'm looking at our SO Twitter page, and I'm going to scroll down to the SO archive control that we've been working with. Right, here it is, the Twitter archive control. Now in order to get a menu to display, when we right click on the header of the SO archive control, we need to include a menu element here within the control definition. We want to do that in between the control and the config element. So I'm going to go ahead and just do a control enter here to get a new line. Oops, that went up. That's not what I expected. Great. So now we are in Twitter archive, and I'll specify a new menu element, and then within that element I have two very important tags which essentially define the keys within the menu dictionary, if you will, in order to discover this context menu. For every header menu of an archive control, we have to declare a context of archive in order to get that to hook up. So we'll say context, and then within that we'll specify archive. And then for a subcontext, it has to be unique for all archive controls in the 6Web application. So we'll say subcontext, and we'll specify Twitter for this one. Now the remaining three tags that I'm going to write here don't necessarily have anything spectacular to have to deal with discovering and displaying that menu, but they are important as well. So we'll just say ID, and we'll give this a binding attribute. And then we're going to specify none here because this ID or this menu item is not bound to anything specific. Almost all archive header control menus have an ID of 0. There's only going to be one for that archive control. I'm going to say position. And position is where you want the cursor to be displayed when the action takes place. So we'll say below cursor. And then finally, the actual click that we want to hook into. So this one we're going to hook into the right click. Great. Now once that's specified, we need to go and declare our definition for this menu so it actually has some content in the SO menu configuration.config file. Now I've already copied this into our custom path folder, the 6Web 3385 folder, and I'm scrolled down here to line 843 because I want to show you the contact person activity archive context menu. That's the one that we were looking at when we were in the application. We click on company and we go down here and you see the list of contacts. If I click on activities and I right click here, this header context menu is essentially exactly what we want in our Twitter context menu, header context menu. So what I'm going to do is inside the SO menu configuration page is just copy and paste this one and modify the changes that need to be changed. So you can see here it has the menu context archive, and then the subcontext is header, and that's specific for the contact person activity archive control. Ours, of course, will be called Twitter. So let's go ahead and just start off by copying this menu definition. Just going to paste it in right below, and I'll call this our Twitter archive. And I'll leave the context to archive, that's required, and then I'll change the subcontext to Twitter. Right. So now within our Twitter menu, we have a list of menu items. Each one of those menu items have a caption associated with it, as well as a URL. It's also probably important to note the type of the menu item, because you'll have normal types and you have divider types. And these simply map to what you would normally expect. If we come back to the company archive, we right click, and you can see that line across the context menu. That, of course, is just a divider. Great. Now, the actions take place when you declare some JavaScript in the URL method. So we'll look here when we click on sort. It will execute this JavaScript method associated with this contact person archive control. When you click on the archive sort config menu item, then it's going to execute this JavaScript to open up the archive configuration dialog. So it's important to note here that there are some query strings associated with this action. When we open the archive configuration dialog, it expects these query strings, provider name and GUI name, and that maps to the provider name and GUI name we declared for our Twitter archive control info types in our archive column list config file. Right, we have the archive element, has a provider name Twitter, and then a GUI name Twitter archive. And remember, we specified the mandatory default and ignore fields. So it's going to pull those from here and make those available inside the archive configuration dialog. And that way it comes to, those are the items that you see when I click on configure, let's say configure columns. These are the items that we see here in the available columns and the columns selected. So it will discover what columns are available. So there's a little bit of naming convention here that we have to stick with that the underlying framework expects. Now this is associated with our Twitter archive control, and you can see that the JavaScript, in order to execute these methods on these menu items associated with it, kind of hints at their association with our archive control. So what we want to do is change the name of the archive control to match ours. Instead of the contact person archive, we're going to call this the Twitter archive control. Down below, if we look at the sort possibilities here, when we're opening up the archive configuration dialog, if we scroll over, we're going to change the provider name to be Twitter, and then the GUI name is going to be Twitter archive. We'll also do that, since we're here, down below for the next one as well. I do not believe casein is sensitive here. So we're going to go ahead and then also lastly change this as well, from contact person archive to Twitter archive, archive control. So why are we calling it Twitter archive, archive control? Well, really what we're doing is we're just saying Twitter archive, and then we have the naming convention is that archive control will follow thereafter. And this Twitter archive comes from the ID we gave our archive control here on our actual page. So the control ID is Twitter archive, and that's what we have to map that to when we are going to invoke these methods in order to execute these actions in our menu items. I'm not going to have to change anything else in the remaining menu items elements because they're pretty much just default, you know, whether or not I want to show help from an index, etc. Okay. This last parameter on this dialog open method is a callback that's going to happen when the dialog, the archive configuration dialog, is closed. And essentially what we want to happen is if we do make any changes to our sort, order, or our column configurations, then we want to call back this Twitter archive control .refresh method. And that will refresh our archive control so that we see the new items in our list. So if I say configure columns and I want to add in, let's say, the time column here, that comes up here, and let's say if I move that up a bit, any of these changes I make, I click on save, that will save these changes, close the dialog, and then call that callback method, which is going to refresh the archive control, and we'll see those changes immediately. And in fact we do. So that's exactly what we want to happen for our control as well. So I've made these changes. I'm going to go ahead and save. I'll come back to our Twitter page, just check that out, make sure it looks okay. Let's go back to the website. If we now click on the Twitter page, let the archive control finish loading. I'll right click on text, and in fact now we see the header menu appears. If I click on configure columns, you'll see that the archive configuration dialog does appear. If we look further at the query strings, we'll see it gives us the correct provider name, the correct GUI name, and in fact we see all of the fields that our archive provider is making available for columns. Great. This video demonstrated for you how to configure the right-click context menu for the header on an archive control. Happy programming.